Коллеги, добрый день. Рады видеть вас у нас на пресс-конференции.
Good afternoon. We're happy to welcome you to the Governor of the Central Bank of Russia press conference, as well as by the Deputy Governor, Alexei Zabotkin. To start with, we will hear the statement of the Governor following the Board of Directors meeting. Good afternoon. Today we have made the decision to keep the key rate at 16% per annum. Current price growth slowed down notably in December and January. The deceleration paused in February, but according to preliminary estimates, resumed in March. Nevertheless, for the moment, it is premature to judge the pace of future disinflationary trends. Besides, we still consider it necessary to maintain tight monetary conditions for a long period. This will help bring inflation back to 4.5% by the end of this year and stabilize it at the target further on. I would now dwell on the reasons behind our today's decision. Firstly, as regards inflation. According to our estimates, underlying current price growth has been in the range of 6 to 7% in annualized terms since the beginning of the year. In contrast to the autumn months, this is already not a double-digit pace, but still considerably above 4%. After 2 months of slowdown, core inflation increased in February. It measures the growth rate of prices for the consumer basket components characterized by lower volatility. The accelerated rise in consumer basket prices in February was caused by high seasonal growth in demand for tourism services. This factor, excluded core inflation, would not have increased. Nevertheless, prices for other market services, such as personal and medical services, as well as transportation, were growing more quickly than the overall price index. Generally, faster price growth in services is one of the indicators of high demand. According to the data available during the first weeks of March, price growth slowed down again. However, these figures are calculated for a limited sample, leaving out the goods and services that notably contributed to price growth in winter. Therefore, it is still too early to judge the pace of disinflation in March. Inflation expectations are an additional factor fueling consumer demand. Although households and businesses have generally lowered their expectations in recent months, they remain high. Moreover, expectations in retail even rose slightly in March. The slowdown in inflation will be gradually decreasing inflation expectations. Secondly, the economy. After a slight deceleration at the end of 2023, according to our estimates, the growth of economic activity has sped up again, primarily in household consumption. Growth in retail is a sign of elevated consumer demand. Consumer sentiment is close to record highs. Household propensity to make large purchases has been increasing since December. We never observed such trends during the previous periods of considerable monetary policy tightening. Investment activity has hit a record high. Although we have not yet received quarterly data, this is evident from indirect indicators. The output of investment goods has reached historically high levels. The import of investment goods has been expanding. Finally, our regional branches report a higher percentage of companies that have increased their production targets. The economy is in the investment phase of growth, which is one of the manifestations of the structural transformation. All this supports high business activity. The Business Climate Index rose to its 12-year maximum. Such a significant increase is associated with the fact that the economy is using almost all production capacities and labor resources. Surveys show that the utilization rate of production capacities reached a record high of 81% at the end of last year. This trend was registered in many regions. More details about the state of production capacities are available in the March issue of our Regional Economy Report. Labor shortages remain a significant constraint on a further expansion of output. The seasonally adjusted unemployment rate declined to 12.7% in January. The labor market tightness has started to increase again. According to business surveys, the labour shortages have worsened the most in metallurgy, the pharmaceutical and chemical industries, as well as mining and quarrying sectors. Companies' competition for labour resources has been intensifying in such conditions. Usually, this does not result in a considerable expansion of the output of goods and services, but rather provokes price increases. In general, there is still a gap between demand and supply. The growth of the economy surpasses its potential, which is evident from persistent high inflationary pressures. Thirdly, monetary conditions have been tightening further. Credit and deposit rates are on the rise. This reflects the market's adjustments to the prior key rate decisions. Yields of federal government bonds have increased by approximately 1 percentage point since the previous board meeting. This is partially attributable to expectations that tight monetary conditions will be maintained for longer. Expectations for fiscal policy have also have a certain impact on OFZ yields. The increase in credit activity has been decelerating, albeit unevenly. On the one hand, the expansion in corporate lending was moderate over the first months of the year. Alongside tight monetary conditions, this might be associated with advance payments under state contracts. Mortgage lending contracted slightly year-on-year. On the other hand, the retail loan portfolio is still growing rapidly, although slower than in the autumn levels. The saving ratio remains high as well. The increase in deposits significantly surpasses normal seasonal dynamics, which is largely driven by high incomes. We are currently observing a rather unusual situation when the surge in savings is accompanied by growing consumption. We expect that in the future, the accumulated effect of tightening monetary conditions encourages people to save even more, which will contribute to a more notable deceleration of inflation. Now, I would like to speak of external conditions. The situation in the world economy has continued to improve in both service and industrial sectors. As a result, prices in commodity markets have started to grow, which will support Russian exports. Overall, the balance of payments is in line with our forecast. After the decline at the beginning of the year, exports have been rebounding, driven by the increase in oil prices. However, secondary sanctions hinder this process. Amid high domestic demand, the growth rate of imports remains elevated. Our monetary policy will contribute to a more balanced expansion of imports that would match the exports potential. I will now speak of risks. As before, the balance of risks is shifted towards pro-inflationary ones. The situation in the labor market is still among such risks. If labor shortages intensify further, the growth in labor productivity might lag behind the rise in wages even more. This might additionally exacerbate the imbalance between demand and supply dynamics amid high utilization of production capacities and labor shortages. Moreover, it might become increasingly difficult to meet elevated demand through imports. An expansion of imports requires higher exports, while the potential to ramp up exports is limited. As to the factors that might speed up disinflation, these are a rapid slowdown in demand growth, as well as an increase in the economy's potential following the transition to the investment growth model. Another factor that will influence the forecast is a possible adjustment of the medium-term budget parameters following the presidential address. When the government presents particular parameters of novelties, we will be able to estimate their effect on the economy and inflation. Winding up, I would like to comment on monetary policy prospects. To ensure a sustained return of inflation to the target, we need to maintain tight monetary conditions for a long period. The major factors influencing the choice of a further key rate path, including a possible transition to its decrease, are inflation dynamics and the balance of risks to the inflation forecast. What are the criteria that would show that the pace of disinflation is sufficient? In the first place, these are the steadiness and pace of the slowdown in current inflation. Another important factor is inflation expectations. In addition, a more balanced rise in consumer activity, lending and imports, as well as an easing in the labor market, will also evidence a sufficient rate of disinflation. The main aspects of the discussion that preceded the vote on our today's decision will be detailed in the summary of the key rate discussions to be released on April 1st. Thank you for your attention. Dear colleagues, your questions now. Do not forget to introduce yourself and identify your agency. Tatiana, in the second row. Good afternoon, Tatiana Chipasova, Interfax Agency. The tone of the statement is unchanged. Does this mean that the most probable decrease or the start of the decrease of the key rate would fall upon the second half of the year? Or is there a chance that it might happen in April following the Board of Directors meeting? And my second question is related to the situation in the fuel market, which is currently under the impact of weekly forecast factors. To what extent that might impact inflation, the inflation expectations, and the monetary policy by the central bank within the next few months? Thank you. Indeed, we have discussed the key rate path. One may go about lowering it after we see convincing and stable lowering on inflation. Currently, based on our estimates, that might probably happen in the second half of the year. The second question was about the fuel market. Undoubtedly, we also take into account the fuel market, but in as far as the inflation forecast is concerned, it is important to consider a compounded set of factors. So currently we do not see that the situation in the fuel market might seriously affect our estimates of inflation. Dear colleagues, next, Masha in the first row. TASS Information Agency, Maria Stepanova. I have several questions. My first one is, what were the options that the Board of Directors considered and as far as the key rate decision was concerned? And the second, the European Commission suggested that the frozen central bank assets should be used to help Ukraine. If this finds support, does the Central Bank of Russia has instruments in order to respond to this? And what kind of instruments these might be? Thank you. Thank you. During the discussion, we arrived at a broad consensus towards the need to keep the rate at the current level. No other alternatives were reviewed substantively. We discussed in detail possible path, or the future path of the rate, and the signals that could be sent, because those who believe that the inflation decline is acquiring stable nature, but also there were such that thought that the inflation risks have grown. And that is why we considered different options, but also the majority of the consensus, similarly, was in favor of retaining the current neutral key rate signal. As far as the European Union action might be concerned with regard to the frozen assets, well, once the decisions are made, we shall take respective measures in order to protect our interests. Next question comes from online, from Yekaterina Titova. Banks.ru from Nizhny Novgorod. Some of the experts are criticizing the increase of the key rate, substantiating it by the fact that the high rate doesn't combat inflation but only provokes the inflation of costs. Also, it slows down the economy as it in the way for the industry to develop. Is that true? When it would be possible to expect the reduction of the key rate? And the second question, will the central bank deter the depreciation of ruble against the dollar? What kind of measures are currently being taken for that? And are there any new measures that you are thinking of introducing? As far as the impact from the high key rate is concerned. The higher key rate combats inflation, and the net effect from the higher key rate unequivocally is the slowdown of inflation. Now, about what is in the way for the industry to develop. And it is exactly that the high key rate is in the way. With regard to investments, not the level of the key rate, but rather the expectations of the future inflation that are creating a stronger impact, the ones that are reflected in the long-term rate. So against the high inflation, there couldn't be any available credits, particularly long-term ones. Once again, let me remind you that a loan or a credit is not the core source of funding investments the world over. It comes from the own capital, reinvesting of profits. Having a credit is just an additional source of growth, and there are a multitude number of companies which are successfully developing without any debt financing. And actually what we see is that the possibility for businesses here to utilize their own capital have grown because the aggregate surplus result is quite high amongst many companies. Another point is that, we've been always talking about the cheap loans. These practically won't help to expand output because the main restrictions are not on the side of lending, but on the side of labor, production capacities. Yes, low lending rates may increase nominal demand, both in investments as well as in consumption, but if the economy doesn't have available resources, that won't expand output. That would only transform itself into higher prices. And that is why mid-term as well as long-term, raising the key rate shall reduce inflation as well as help businesses get longer-term markers and indicators that would help them develop their investment plans and create favorable development conditions. Now, as far as the exchange rate is concerned, changing the exchange rates, along with other factors, does impact inflation and may drive us towards some additional action as long as we see that this particular factor works or contradicts our inflation targets. Similarly, we influence the exchange rate via the key rate, and so raising the key rate is specifically the tool which raises the traction of savings in rubles, holding back the exaggerated demand for ruble and balancing the exchange rate. And so the effect from the monetary policy plus changes in the trading balance, these are the factors which primarily define the exchange rate, because nevertheless our core objective, where we target inflation in reducing it and making it reach the declared level close to 4%, rather than a certain exchange rate. The exchange rate shall remain as it is supposed to be, so that it reconciles itself with the inflation target close to 4% towards the end of the year. And it can be different against different combinations of indicators in the foreign trade. As we used to mention it on more than one occasion, the monetary policy, which provides for price stability, simultaneously provides for the stability in the currency exchange market. Colleagues, next, Masha, in the third row. Maria Filushina, Bitkogan. Is the Bank of Russia ready to face possible sanctions against the Moscow Exchange and the National Depository Center? And if that happens, how the currency trading is going to be organized? Well, without doubt, we are in the state of permanent readiness to face the strengthening of sanctions, and we're considering various ways together with the Moscow Exchange in order to ensure that our infrastructure is fully operational. So such measures are being discussed preliminarily. Thank you. Colleagues, next, Sergei. Sergei Bolotov, arguments and facts. Could you please say whether the central bank is spending its reserves to maintain the ruble exchange rate? If positive, how does that affect the key rate path? And second question, how in the mind of the central bank the possible individual income tax might be affected and business taxes? Is it pro-inflationary or disinflationary factor, do you believe? No. We do not spend our reserves to maintain the exchange rate because this is something that you can conclude from the statistics covering the golden currency reserves. All possible changes in the golden currency reserves have been brought about by the fiscal rule transactions and re-evaluation because the ruble exchange rate is a floating one, and so we do not undertake any special measures to maintain the ruble exchange rate at a specific level. So the high rate that we're currently seeing is aimed at slowing down inflation. We don't conduct transactions in the FX market using our reserves following the fiscal rules since February 2022. In February 2022, it was necessary in view of the financial stability risk. Currently, we don't see financial stability risk, so there is consequently no need for us to transact in such a way. Now, with respect to the key rate, it is being affected by the whole complex of the domestic and external circumstances, and against different composition thereof, the aim of bringing the inflation down to target might be linked to different values that you might read in the currency market. As far as the tax novelties might be concerned in terms of their effect on the inflation, we do not review each factor with respect to each individual tax because what is important to us is the general configuration of the fiscal policy. I mean, the fiscal structural balance and the structural deficit. Of course, a configuration of taxes might be impactful, but it is less significant. It is premature to come up with an estimate. After the government comes up with its proposition, we will specifically do that. Thank you. The next question comes from Kemerovo, from Vyacheslav Vorozheikin, A42.ru, Internet Gazette. Good afternoon. Vyacheslav Vorozheikin from Kemerovo. The President, in his address to the Federal Assembly, announced a number of social programs, new ones and renewed ones, and how the expected government spending might affect inflation. Thank you. Thank you for your question. Well, indeed, the fiscal policy and the path for the fiscal policy normalization impacts our key rate deliberations. But here one should not simply consider the additional spending issues, because it is important which sources that such spending is going to be funded from. Out of the general fiscal construction. As I said, we will be able to assess it once specific government proposals are available. Colleagues, please, your questions. Natasha, please, in the third row. Natalia Trushina, Moscow Komsomolets. I've got the following questions. The Bank of Russia left its forecast about inflation unchanged before the end of the year, the level of 4.5%. But at the same time, the slowdown then the Russian Office of Statistics specified by March 18th, on top of what was there on March 11th, was not really big, 7.73. Now, well, I would like to find out, based on which factors the Bank of Russia keeps its forecast, considering the fact that from July 1st we have a planned increase of the utility services rates. Also, the Russian economy is susceptible to the black swan things such as refineries going down and some other various surprises. Well, let me start from the annual inflation, the figures that you've quoted. I would like to particularly note that the annual inflation is a lagging indicator because it demonstrates inflation over the previous 12 months period. And when making our decision, we're paying more attention upon the current inflationary pressure and also apply
the stable inflation net of the seasonal indicators. And so we believe that our monetary policy is the one that should truly bring inflation towards the end of the year close to 4.5% target. This is the viewpoint through which we assess various measures and steps which are necessary from the point of view of the monetary policy. Yes, inflation is currently going down, but we will still need to assess how stable is the trend and how strong is the pace, whether it's enough for us to achieve this outcome, and depending upon that, if need be, we will adjust the monetary policy as well. Yes, the utility services tariffs may grow during the summer. We take this into account in our forecast. This could be a local current inflation spike. But overall, the monetary policy, the one that is currently putting together tight conditions, would propel disinflation. As far as black swans are concerned, they may always happen, but we have base forecast. If there are any risks and any shocks, because we always talk about them, both may happen. And of course, depending upon the significance of such unexpected events, we will consider the kind of decisions that would be most befitting. Maybe Mr. Zabotkin, yes, with regard to the annual inflation. Currently, the annual inflation reflects the price growth effect from 2023. I mean, very high price rate growth, which we experienced since July till November last year. Once we enter December 2024, those pace of growth won't be reflected in the annual inflation. It will contain only the price inflation effects from January to November 2024. In January and February, currently in the current year, seasonally adjusted, recalculated, and annualized, annualized is below 7%. Colleagues, please, Marina, in the second row. Marina Pimenova, NTV Business News. In the end of February, a central bank revoked the license of the Kyiv Bank. Quite obviously, many use the electronic purses to pay their purchases abroad. In the current conditions, the Russians have very few possibilities to do that. Under such circumstances, hasn't the central bank considered not the option of revoking licenses, but to bring banks to the external management? And the second question, over the past months, the central bank revoked licenses from 3 additional banks, but before that, for a year and a half, it hadn't done so. Now, the media is writing that it was like almost an end to the moratorium was announced to revoke licenses. Is it true, and should we expect new revocations to take place? The question of financial health of credit institutions is being considered in the first place whenever we talk about meaningful, significant credit institutions which experience problems with financial stability, which have lack of capital and the ability to settle. When the Bank of Russia was revoking the license from the Kyiv Bank, it was not because of its financial instability, but specifically because it was involved in conducting doubtful, dubious transactions, large scale, and that was the result of our supervisory work. So Kyiv Bank, in this regard, was not a significant credit institution. That is why, in our mind, there was no reason to bring in external management. As far as the revocation of licenses is concerned, our work here is very much to the pinpoint kind of an approach, and so revocation of a license is an extreme measure preceded by a very comprehensive set of efforts. We issue a notification, so this is a very much specific kind of a decision-making process. We do maintain supervision of the banking industry. There hasn't been any moratorium, but let's say, if situations occur when banks do not improve their status, whether because of the capital inadequacy or because of a growing scale of doubtful operations and transactions, we do take measures, but as far as certifications are concerned, we do not make any forecasts with that regard, because this all comes as a result of the supervisory work. The next question comes from Anna Kurshina from Kursk, from the One for Another newspaper. Hello, Anna Kurshina. Weekly One for One Gazette. The high key rate so far hasn't produced any tangible impact upon the reduction of the demand for the goods which the household traditionally have been buying on credit. Considering the January-February record statistics have come out in the area of auto loans. Tell us how the central bank assesses the situation and why the transmission mechanisms hasn't yet proven themselves to be effective. Well, transmission mechanism is effective, and we do note it, amongst other things, in the lending dynamics, although it is not even in as far as segments and timing is concerned, but nevertheless, we do observe the slowing in the lending growth rates. But once again, let me remind you that for a fully fledged implementation of the monetary policy facts and the decisions we make and the transmission mechanism as we describe it, it is in between 3 quarters to 18 months might be required. And actually, we expect that the peak from the raising of the key rate last year will coincide with the second quarter this year. And by the way, the key rates also impacted the auto loans. The average market rate has grown in this sector. But the fact of the matter is that auto loan experiences a very special kind of a situation. The market is recovering there after it plummeted, and indeed in January and February the banks issued almost twice as many auto loans as through the same period last year. But it was the result of the government support measures renewed, as well as the growing demand for loans for cars despite the growing key rates. Besides, the auto lending was supported by the readiness amongst the dealers to sell out considerable stocks which had been imported before the utilization tax was introduced. So all these factors together influenced the auto loan industry. Elena Fabrichna, next one. Elena Fabrichna, Reuters. Is there a final decision already following the presidential decree for a compulsory sale of currency profits that is in place until the end of April, and if positive, for how long? I am not aware of this. You know our position. I'm not going to repeat it. Yes, Svetlana, in the second row, please. Svetlana Otlik from RIA Novosti. Could you please tell us, can one say that the peak on inflation in Russia has been passed? Because in the beginning of March, you said that the bank was considering the possibility of expanding the insurance protection upon people's money held in the electronic purses. Could you tell us whether there is an already existing option to solve that issue, and what the central bank thinks to be a worthy amount of money to cover with this protection, or are there any other tools that you're considering to make this work? As far as the peak of inflation is concerned, the peak of the current inflation, I mean the one that we're living through right now, we feel we passed through it in autumn. But in annual terms, the peak of inflation may happen in the second quarter, right, Mrs. Zabotkin? Right, yes. So, bearing in mind the fact that the annual inflation is the inflation that we see over the previous 12 months, also resonating with the base effect, but the peak of the current inflation pressure has already been passed, we feel. As far as ensuring the electronic purses are concerned, we're currently considering what kind of electronic purses could be subject of such a coverage. Based on preliminary evaluation, it would be worthwhile to ensure funds in the electronic purses that have gone through identification, because only in this case one can establish the recipient of such an insurance coverage. The amount of money held in such individualized electronic purses is bigger than an anonymous one, but the balance is not significant. So we believe that the overall insurance coverage compensation, like in the case of the bank, 1,400,000 rubles, is more than sufficient to protect the clients. That is why, yes, after this whole situation, we believe it is indeed worthwhile to expand this protection to cover the electronic purses. As far as other instruments are concerned, let me remind you about the individual investment accounts protection, because the draft bill has already been submitted into the Russian parliament. Apart from it, shortly we intend to share with the banks and the Russian MPs and the government our initiative to increase the limitation of insurance coverage to include the irrecoverable ruble certificates, the deposits, and the escrow accounts, with a simultaneous reduction of the contributions from these accounts into the deposit insurance system. Thank you. Next, Fyodor, please. Fyodor Ivanov, Invest Future. Hello. I have two questions. The first one is about the consolidation of the banking sector. Does the central bank see any risks there? And my second question, will the exchange of the blocked investor assets affect the ruble exchange rate? If positive, in which way? As far as the consolidation in the banking sector is concerned, what kind of effects we might experience, we feel that that would strengthen competition amongst the biggest banks, and consequently they will be able to offer better services to households and businesses with better offerings. As far as the possible impact of the swap of the blocked assets upon the exchange rate, we believe that there's not going to be any pronounced impact like that. But if such a swap takes place, then people will be able to resort to their ruble assets from the previously blocked accounts. But a certain element may theoretically flow into the currency market, but we feel that the current ruble rates are much more attractive, and the key rate, the high key rate makes the high banking deposit rates a more attractive tool than investing rubles into currency. Would you like to add something? No. Thank you so much. Next question comes online from Denis Yalachovsky, Complex Interest Project. Denis, go ahead, your question. 1, 2, yes, okay, thank you so much. Just a couple of questions, if I may. Inflationary expectations, my first question, they remain unanchored, and actually even the analysts that the Bank of Russia surveys for its macro forecast expect that this year's inflation is going to be 5.7%, the 7 percentage points higher than the current central bank forecast, as well as the expectations amongst the businesses are higher than amongst the household. What are the reasons you see that despite the fact that the central bank has been targeting inflation for the past 10 years, the inflation expectation hasn't remained anchored, and does the central bank considers new tools, new measures to anchor them? And my second question is about the swapping of the blocked assets, because since Monday Monday, the collection of the applications is going to start, with the support of the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank. But on the side of the Western regulators, depositors, and there is no official readiness to support this procedure that we publicly have heard. So how real do you believe this procedure of the asset swap may be? Thank you. Well, indeed, the inflation expectations are unanchored. To us, this is the subject for concern. Not only their elevated level, but also them remaining unanchored. The fact that they are currently high and unanchored is the consequence of, indeed, the high inflation and a lengthy period within which inflation deviated from the target. Now, what kind of measures there could be? The only measure is to steadfastly reduce inflation, bringing it to our target and keeping it at that level. We previously used to say, in order to anchor the inflation expectations, what is necessary is, first of all, for the inflation to remain close to the target for a long period of time, and secondly, so that the market players gain an experience so as to understand that despite the external and other reasons, when inflation starts speeding up, the central bank pursues the policy to reduce it down to the target. That is the most important thing. But at the same time, I would like to note, because we also do see that inflation is going down and the inflation expectations do follow suit and amongst the businesses and the households, although their level is still quite high. It is higher than the one we recall from 2017-19 when the inflation was on average at about 4%. The inflation expectations are higher than what is necessary in order for the inflation to go down steadily and remain at 4%. Len, would you like to add something, please? No. Maybe the only thesis that we are reiterating every now and then is that the level of the midterm and particularly long-term rates in the economy, in the interest, is defined by the inflation expectations. So the only way to enjoy a moderate level of rates is to have low and anchored inflation expectations, which can only be achieved through the low inflation. Right. So as far as unblocking the assets are concerned, also, from the very beginning, we've been saying that we are creating the opportunities for such an unblocking of the assets to take place. But this is a voluntary process, both on the part of the residents as well as non-residents. And that is why the rules of trading do envisage two scenarios: once the trading has taken place and once it has not. And so writing off securities from the accounts of their owners can take place only if transactions do take place. So we'll take a look at the way this instrument is sought after. But the ultimate target was to create conditions so that it could be utilized if both parties, both sides, are willing to. Thank you. Thank you. Dear colleagues, Rita, in the third row. Margarita Mordovina, RBK. I will have two questions. The first one, today, the decision was published by the Perm Region Arbitration Tribunal to sequester shares of private investor of the Solikamsk factory, the ones that the investors bought from the exchange, and that was a law-abiding acquisition. Does the central bank see here a problem and the need to create an additional tool to protect private investors in such an environment? If so, what kind of protection mechanisms we may talk about? And the second question is about the Kiwi Bank. Does the central bank has any financial grievances towards the former owners of the bank? If so, who specifically and what is the amount of such grievances? As far as such a precedent when the minority shareholders' stock was arrested, the ones that they had acquired through the legal trading, we are really concerned by this because that is an important factor which may affect the trust amongst the retail investors in the stock market. If we want to bring the resources into the economic development, as well as utilize the capital development, the capital market. The ability to maintain such trust is super important. So we are indeed concerned, and so we will definitely look into what can be done here in the legal area in the first place. We will consider what we may do. Now, as far as, raising claims against the managers and the former proprietors of the bank, the Bank of Russia, under the law, may raise material claims against the proprietors and managers once the external management is doing its work. And when we fund this, in case the bank is announced insolvent, we can bring the proprietors to account via subsidiary responsibility. The Kiwi bank's license was revoked because of multiple infringements under the law. And that is why very recently we forwarded a claim into the arbitration tribunal about the force for liquidation. And the bank does have significant surplus of money, more than 80 billion of money. I mean, in terms of its assets exceeding its liabilities. And so we act on a firm assumption that all of its liabilities are going to be paid off. Yes, Ivan, in the second row. Next question. Ivan Schliegen, for Bank Ru. Two questions. They are related to the presidential task. The first one is about subsidized mortgage, because the president concentrates attention upon the subsidized mortgage program being extended. And so it's interesting how, under such circumstances, the central bank will be capable of fine-tuning the subsidized mortgage program so that it wouldn't negatively impact the development of the mortgage market. The first question. My second question is also about the presidential task towards increasing the stock market twice compared to its current level. What can be done here? What is meant by this particular wording? Thank you. As far as subsidized mortgage is concerned, our position is that broad, unindividualized program must exhaust its effectiveness in summer and not be renewed, while individualized programs, including the family mortgage, is something that we have always been supportive of. But it's the government authority in terms of how such subsidized programs are going to be constructed. We will take these decisions into account overall once we make up our mind about the key rate, but we don't look at each market separately, because what's important to us is how the lending volumes impact our ability to achieve the inflation targets. Mr. Zabotkin, would you like to add something? Yes, I believe that an important premise is also that it is important to us for there to be some sort of sensitivity in terms of the lending rate growth and making sure that the loans are attractive and aligned with our credit policy. So the kind of programs which in the preliminary fashion set the levels for the end user must be limited, because otherwise the lending sensitivity to our policy is falling. As far as meeting the demands in the Russian stock market, I not only believe it is possible, I would say that it is necessary, because the potential of the stock market currently in this country is not being sufficiently utilized to boost the development of the domestic economy. Not only that, but also to meet the needs amongst this household to diversify their savings and their investments. And we do see that as the situation becomes more stable, the businesses recover in their demand for the capital market tools, because they find it more interesting to use it. And both the bond market starts growing as well. The stock market expands. The corporate bond market currently exceeds 23 billion. The capitalization of the stock market exceeds 60 billion market. And so last year, 12 SPOs and IPOs occurred, and actually that is the highest record for the domestic market over the past decade. So we do see that there is a very live and strong interest towards it, and so we hope that this process will be supported by many programs, including the program of subsidizing high-tech, fast-growing companies from the small and medium-sized business sector, where measures are envisaged to support the pre-IPOs and subsidize getting access to exchange trading, various grants to small and medium-sized businesses, which, amongst other things, will make small and medium-sized businesses more active in entering the stock market. Also, various tax exemptions may be considered, but this is the issue that requires discussion with the Ministry of Finance. And also, what is very important, something that I repeat more than often, in order for this to happen, in order for the stock market to demonstrate this kind of a pace of growth, which realistically is necessary, it is important to have trust from investors to it, as well as a sufficient level of minority owners' protection. This is very scrupulous and very hard-working effort. The next question comes from Tatiana Ridyuk from St. Petersburg, TT Finance Portal. Tatiana, please, your question. Well, she's disconnected. All right, we take a question from the room here. Tatiana, in the second row, please. Hello. You said that the import dynamics remain elevated. What are your expectations for the month of March and the following months? Can one say that the effect of the sectional restrictions did not turn out to be as strong as the expectations towards it were in January, February? Also, the discrepancies between the central bank statistics and the customs, Federal Customs Agency for January. Why is this discrepancy? This question comes from Tatiana Yudovina, Kommersant newspaper. Thank you. As far as imports are concerned, the import dynamics are being impacted by different factors, including the logistical difficulties and settlements which come from sanctions. So the import dynamics, we believe, to a large extent, are also being subject to the higher ruble demand in imports. And because we currently see that the key rate, in as far as this part is concerned, is effective, import has stabilized, but its various effects are going to manifest themselves further. Alexei Borisovich, imports and the description. Yeah, if we talk about the levels of imports, if I remember clearly, it is slightly lower than it was in the first half year last year, so we're talking that it has come down and keeps being at the current level. So I mean, we do not characterize it as an elevated one, and our monetary policy is the one that prevents it from being overheated, bearing in mind also the export opportunities that we still possess at this point in time. Now, the second question, the discrepancy in the statistics between the Federal Customs Service and the payment balance. These are different sets of data, because the data from the Federal Tax Service, Federal Customs Service, sorry, is a prevalent data points in the data that is reflected in the payment balance, but the whole of the payment balance is being estimated, accounting for additional set of transactions. For example, if our fishermen caught fish in the global ocean, and from the point of exports, let's say, if they sold it at a foreign port facility, that is going to be part of the exports following the methodology of the payment balance, but is not going to be part of what the customs agency is going to include into its report, because it hasn't passed through the Russian customs posts. But if you follow the trends, they are almost similar, and primarily this is not only the thing that comes out of the Federal Customs Service statistics. Thank you very much. Tatiana couldn't join us from St. Petersburg, and so she forwarded her question in writing. Tatiana Tendruk, online portal TT Finance. The 1st of July, the subsidized mortgage program comes to an end. The Bank of Russia, on more than one occasion, stated that it would insist upon individualized programs. Does the central bank has an opinion about what kind of mortgage program subsidized one should look like? Who is going to be its recipients in the first place, and what will happen to the mortgage lending after July 1st? Well, indeed, we have been championing a very much individualized kind of subsidized mortgage program, because the government subsidized mortgage should cover the people who require help in funding their acquisition of housing based on general economic activities or within the individual regional programs. For example, the family mortgage program that we support helps the families with children buy housing and helps to resolve demographic problems, but also in terms of the subsidized programs. It is the government which defines the conditions. There is an interagency working group which operates under the auspices of the Russian parliament. So currently the discussion is underway about how the interest rate subsidization program should look like. We participate in such discussions. Once certain decisions take place, we will share them with you. So what we count upon that this transition from non-individualized to individualized programs will lead to a better balanced and healthier development of the mortgage market. Yes, the pace of the issuance of such lending and the portfolio growth will slow down, but still we would expect the mortgage portfolio to grow within the year at the level of 7 to 12%. And this is no small figures, particularly considering the fact that the mortgage portfolio has grown very quickly and continues to grow from an already high base. In 2025-26, we believe that the mortgage market should achieve a balanced pace of growth at about 10 to 12 to 15%, considering all of the government support measures. Thank you. Dear colleagues, your questions. Evgeny. Good afternoon. Evgeny Rudchenko, Izvestia newspaper. You noted that because of the income growth, the households may now grow their consumption despite the fact of the high interest rate. The banks are trying to adjust their income in the deposit, and as the trends grow, this may change. Do you see that there is any danger in terms of growing the deposits to grow further within midterm, and how that particular factor might impact the monetary policy? And my second question is, currently we see that the banking's licensing continues to be revoked because of the risk transactions. We also know that the banks forwarded recommendation letters to them. Now, what kind of measures the bank is considering in this way, and how does it plan to impact the grey payment flows that may come out of the banks, and whether there will be any new initiatives that you might pursue? I would ask Mrs. Zabotkin to answer your first question. Thank you very much for the question. It is a very important one. And it is true that the saving behavior on the part of the households, including their propensity to save part of their income in the form of additional deposits, is an important indicator that we trace and track when assessing the level of tightness of our monetary policy. And so the short answer is that we're going to monitor this indicator, and certainly if we get the feeling that because of the growing inflationary expectations, or because of the inflation expectations staying at a high level, or because of any other factors, the savings behavior is less pronounced, that would be an obstacle for us to soften our monetary policy. As far as our recommendations for money transfers are concerned, that is related to the work we do to combat doubtful transactions, because we've been observing recently that despite the general decline of the level of the doubtful transactions, the frequency of utilization of such a channel as P2P transaction has grown, and so we have forwarded recommendations to the bank about what they should do, how should they identify this, and what kind of work they should do. So we would analyze, we'll take a look at how they do that, and if need be, undertake additional measures. But one should say that this market of dubious transactions, it's mobile, residual, moves from one form into the other, transfigures itself. So we're trying to be agile and to cut off such channels on a timely basis. Dear colleagues, please. Oh, yes, the next question comes online. Anna? Anna, can you hear us? Anna is not hearing us, so, well, all right, next question. No, good afternoon, Anna Gromova. On finance, there was an information in the media that the central bank might be obliged to clear through the Minister of Construction his decision about the macro-prudential limitations in as far as mortgage issuances are concerned. Could you explain how that might work? What is it for if this bill is passed? Are there any targets that one should keep in mind in terms of the level of lending that might be made available for the currently housing that's currently being constructed? First of all, the macro-prudential limitation as far as mortgage is concerned are not aimed at affecting the overall mortgage lending development. They are aimed at limiting lending to the overburdened borrowers who are in the risk area. And so application of such measures may impact the overall lending development, but that is not really the case, because we do not support the idea to clear macroprudential decisions with the Minister of Construction, because that contradicts the status of the Central Bank of Russia, as well as its authority in the area of the banking regulation. Now, if the kind of decision that we have proposed with respect to the macroprudential regulation are going to be supported, we will continue using macroprudential markups. We will simply strengthen them so that they would be prohibitive in as far as highly risk loans are concerned, which might also transform into higher capital pressure that the banks might experience. But we have the tool set and we're going to apply it. We feel that it is much more appropriate to combine such instruments. I mean, macroprudential and the markups. If there is no macroprudential limitation, then we will use the markups. I believe this is a fallacy to believe that only macroprudential limitations and only the application thereof may lead to the mortgage market development slowing down. It has to be a balanced process in order not to reduce the availability of housing to the household. So firstly, we have the key rate that we use to impact the mortgage market via the market segment, macroprudential markups. So we're going to apply all of these instruments. Thank you. Dear colleagues, Tatiana in the last row. Good afternoon, Tatiana Voronova of Frank Media. If I may, one specific question with regard to mortgage market. What is the pace that the central bank is targeting when it talks about the stabilization of the situation in the market? Because based on our observations, the banks are reducing their issuance forecast, because more often we're currently hearing 40% rather than 20%, as was the case in the beginning of the year. So what do you believe? The decline currency is sufficient in terms of its pace? Is the regulator satisfied with that? And my second question about the cross-border settlements, because almost a year ago the central bank was telling us that there is a problem about the rupees hanging in limbo, after which the banks assured us that the problem was resolved. And so as far as we understand, some of the settlements was moved into RMBs and dirhams. But against the backdrop of what we are observing, various problems with the Chinese banks and the banks from the Arab Emirates, do you foresee any risks in the cross-border payments for imports? And so another question to the very same point, imports and exports. In the beginning of the year, the share of ruble payments has gone down in the exports payment structure. Can you explain what is the reason here? Thank you. As far as the mortgage question is concerned, we believe that the current year mortgage growth pace, in order to remain balanced, that must be within 7 to 12%. But we don't have any targeting for growing of lending in this or that segments. No, it's just our forecast, 7 to 12%. And that it would be a balanced kind of growth in the mortgage market compared to the 35% last year. That is a substantial decrease in the development pace, but still, that is the growth from the high base. Next, we believe that the balanced growth is in between 10 to 15%. Alexei Borisovich? Yes, just an additional specification. We have always been thinking in terms of the portfolio growth. And the figures that we've quoted, they apply to the volumes issued. Now, to what extent that might change, the sensitivity in the issues is stronger than compared to the portfolio growth against the market environment changing. As the governor stated, this year, in terms of the portfolio growth, we continue to expect growth above the inflation, 12%, in as far as the mortgage portfolio is concerned. As far as international cross-border settlements are concerned, due to the sanctions, of course, there are complexities in doing the cross-border payments. The banks and businesses find different ways via different countries and very flexibly change their ways and means once difficulties grow. As far as India is concerned, the Russian banks are actively expanding the two-way settlement channels, utilize different currencies as far as the share of rubles. And we are scrupulously monitoring the currency structure that is being used in cross-border payments. We monitor the share of the rubles, the currencies of the friendly countries. Within any given year, these shares may fluctuate depending upon the situation is evolving. There could be various changes in the share of rubles, but overall, the share of this particular group, which includes the use of rubles as well as the friendly countries' currencies, is growing, has growing. In the first half year, it grew last year, and in the second half, it remained almost at the stable level. And in the beginning of 2024, the share of this combined group has somewhat grown. But the subjects of foreign economic activity, they choose currencies of their own volition based on their preferences, as well as their own possibility to use this or that payment channel. Yes, thank you very much, colleagues. Meeting in the last row, please. Good afternoon. Global TV China Network. Dmitry Maslov, Moscow correspondent. The salient points in the communications and relationship between the central bank and the Bank of China, what are they this year and for the next year? What are the issues on the main agenda between the both regulators? Well, obviously, there are settlements in national currencies. Maybe there is something that you have already discussed with your Chinese counterparts with regards to the forthcoming BRICS summit, BRICS Plus, more appropriate to say. What do you plan to discuss in the autumn? I don't know. This is not near, but time flies quickly. Well, you've answered the questions to a large extent yourselves, because the focus of our cooperation, of course, in developing bilateral payments using national currencies, setting the proper conditions for that, that is our main focus. Of course, we exchange opinions on different issues, including like digital innovation. You know that we are promoting the project of the digital ruble. China is very well advanced in its application of digital technologies in financial sector. As far as BRICS is concerned, similarly, the issue of payments and settlements is also important there, as well as setting up a reliable payment system. That is the main focus, I should say. Dear colleagues, are there any more questions? Yes, Marina, over there, please, in the third row. Marina Strelnikova, Gazeta.ru. I've got two questions. The first one, previously you've noted that the peak of the Russian economy overheated occurred in the autumn of 2023. Now, is the economy remaining in this status, and does it raise any concerns amongst the Bank of Russia? My second question, one of these days, recently, the Minister of Finance called upon accelerating the introduction of the digital ruble. Does the Central Bank of Russia seize any interest amongst the Russians towards the digital national currency? Thank you very much. As far as the state of affairs in the economy is concerned, yes, we do continue noting it's being overheated, but this overheating or the overhang of the demand over the supply, the gap there, is not a measurable value, but nevertheless one of the indicators of the level of such an overheat or the issuance gap is inflation. It signals this, whether there is any disbalance or there isn't. And we do see that the inflation is slowing down right now. So in this sense, one may say that the peak of this overheating has been passed, but nevertheless, the demand growth in the meantime continues to exceed supply. Would you add something? Well, I mean, yes, the second indicator is definitely the situation in the labor market, because businesses, again, are talking about the situation for employers becoming more difficult, is they feel that there's limited in bringing in labor resources so far. This situation hasn't turned around. And as far as the development of the digital ruble project is concerned, we're currently going through the phase of experimenting, as they say. It includes a limited number of participants, and so far a limited number of entities has been involved, about 600, but we feel that it is really something that deserves being further expanded. As far as the general attitude amongst people towards the digital ruble, there are two types of them. There are some people who express a certain skepticism and pessimism towards everything new, and there are others who are very much quick on the uptake as far as any innovations are concerned, so the attitudes are quite different. But here I would like to underscore that the use of the digital rubles is something that we believe is of a principal importance and should be absolutely voluntary. I mean, if people would like to use them, like you remember so many years ago, the debit cards also was the kind of phenomenon that was not quite popular, but gradually, step by step, people have grown used to it and were actively using it. And so I would say that currently the share of non-cash transactions is quite large. So we similarly discuss with the Treasury various issues of how the digital rubles could be used in the fiscal processes. And so we're currently running an experiment, and we're testing the possibility of fiscal payments into the budget by individuals, households and businesses, as well as the reverse process from the fiscal system to businesses and households. So that is also quite a high potential area for the use of the digital rubles. Thank you. Dear colleagues, any questions on that? I guess this is the last question. Julia, please. Julia, don't click portal. Could you please tell us what is going to be the effect from the subsidized mortgage programs made more tighter? Is there any measurable outcome already? And the question about the real estate. In the fourth quarter last year, the price gap between the primary and the secondary real estate was 44%. So what kind of gap you see now? Is it shrinking? As far as changes in the subsidized mortgage programs are concerned, yes, they have been tightened, and that indeed led to some slowdown of this subsidized mortgage market development. But it's too early to talk about the result, because that tightening occurred not long ago. But overall, we see that the volumes have contracted compared to the last autumn peak values, but higher than in the first few months of the last year. And so the main effect will be the expiration of the mortgage programs, which is unindividualized, which will happen towards the end of June. As far as the real estate market is concerned, indeed, the gap between the first and primary and secondary market, 44%, is quite a huge gap. Let me remind you, before the mass mortgage programs were introduced, that was 10%. And that may create risks to the households in terms of the ability to divest from the housing in the secondary market, when in the primary market the owners had acquired it at very high prices. Now, I mean, the first quarter data, I think, will be available only in May, and only after that we'll be able to tell you what is happening to this price gap. But in our mind, this gap ought to shrink following the decisions that have been made with respect to the subsidized mortgage. But this is definitely not going to be a quick process. So this gap might take, you know, some time in contracting. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. We look forward to seeing you here again in the future.